Canadian defense thinking, like American defense thinking, always prioritizes defense overseas. That's the priority. We meet the threats to North America, to the homeland, over there. Well, the current threat environment says that we can't do that anymore. We cannot simply ignore North American defense.
Welcome to the latest episode of the CDA Institute's Expert Series. In this installment, we spoke with Professor James Fergusson, Professor of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba. Fergusson discusses the potential for increased NATO involvement in the Canadian Arctic, the feasibility, benefits, and challenges of incorporating Greenland and Denmark into NORAD, what kinds of upgrades we can expect as part of the North Warning System update, and the capabilities that are needed in the new threat environment, some of the challenges that a fully integrated air and missile defense system could present for the current NORAD mission suite relative to US-Canada cooperation on continental defense, and whether the war in Ukraine has impacted Canada's views on and Canada's approach to NORAD modernization. So Canada has historically discouraged NATO involvement in the North American Arctic. Should this change, and would keeping NATO and NORAD separate create vulnerabilities that could be exploited by Russia or China?
I think the question is not if it should change, it is more if it will change. Although NATO has become more involved for a variety of reasons in the Arctic, I think Canadian policymakers still are very sensitive to a major role in the Canadian Arctic. And part of the problem, of course, is what NATO is thinking about and what Canada, relative to the United States, North America, which has always been kept separate between the two, have been thinking about are two different things. We're thinking about the defense of North America, or to develop a robust deterrence posture against potential new generation threat environment emanating from Russia, potentially in the future, China. NATO is thinking more about the traditional sea lines of communication issue, and driven, at least in my view, by American naval thinking that the way to deal with threats to sea lines of communication is to be able to move forward as fast as possible to prevent the infiltration of Russian naval forces into the Atlantic to threaten those, is distinct from the threat of air and sea launch, both long-range cruise missiles and hypersonic vehicles that would track down the east coast of Greenland, between Greenland and Iceland, roughly, towards targets in North America. That problem didn't exist, of course, in the past because the technology wasn't there. Well, now that problem exists. So how do you coordinate the seam, or how you deal with the seam, and where is the seam drawn between NATO and NORAD, given that we have different interests involved in the defense of North America? Can this then be exploited by the Russians, for example? Potentially, yes, but a lot of it depends on two key geostrategic locations. One is Greenland itself, which is always, because of its relationship with Denmark, has always looked east, and the other is Iceland, which has always looked east to NATO as well, notwithstanding bilateral agreements between the United States and both of them with regards to defense and security. If you think in terms of the American Unified Command Plan, for example, the issue is where is the seam between European Command and North American Command? That's NORAD and US NORTHCOM, which is right now structured that basically at the southernmost middle point of Greenland, to the west is US NORTHCOM and NORAD, to the east is NATO, whether you need to move that seam to deal with this problem. And then, of course, the resources that go to it. I think that is a problem, as I mentioned, because NORAD and NATO, if I put them in those two contexts, think differently about this and have different requirements. So can it be exploited as it exists? Yes, it can, because how they think about this and what resources they're going to apply. Can the application of NATO-related, which is really American, to a lesser degree British and Norwegian capabilities, be sufficient to be able to deal with both problems? That, of course, is, I don't know. We're getting into highly technical, highly classified information here. But certainly politically, I think that at the end of the day, I think this government is still going to be wary about NATO starting to move into anything around the Canadian Arctic, at least. So the rhetoric may be there, but I think in reality, I can't imagine, and of course, they're silent now, but many will argue that the involvement of NATO further into the Canadian Arctic area will be problematic in terms of the relationship, will potentially escalate the adversarial relationship, and that may in itself be problematic.
Two RAND senior fellows recently argued that NORAD should consider opening its doors to Greenland and Denmark. What is the feasibility of this? What are the challenges and potential benefits?
Well, I think my colleague Andrew Sharon and I have argued this for some time now, the same thing. I think it's very important, given the fact that you have Russian bomber training flights that fly down the east coast of Greenland. And I think this also applies potentially to Iceland as well. Given the long-range nature of these launch platforms and their capabilities with cruise missiles and hypersonics, that this certainly has to be covered. Now, historically in the past, as far as we can figure out, or as I know, this was done bilaterally. There are numerous historical American bases in Greenland. But given the need to integrate all this surveillance capabilities and intercept capabilities together, you really need to bring Greenland into play. And it makes little sense to, given that NORAD's mission is the aerospace warning and control of North America air, in effect, notwithstanding its ballistic missile warning mission. Whatever you arrange bilaterally between the United States and Greenland, Denmark, you have to, of course, integrate this into NORAD. It's got to go into NORAD, so it makes no sense to leave them outside of NORAD and rather bring them in. And on that note, I would point out that Denmark has now sent a liaison officer informally into NORAD headquarters. So it gives us an idea of Denmark's interest. And of course, this raises the thorny issue of Denmark's relationship to the autonomous region of Greenland and the tensions that exist there, and Canadian policy about how they want to deal with this, even if I'm not even sure if we're thinking about this, at least not in Global Affairs Canada. At least I have no evidence of it. So this is an important development that needs to be done. If you think about the recent announcement about what we now call, the Canadians now call, the Northern Approaches Surveillance System, you recall the North Warning System extends down Labrador, but it doesn't extend over into Greenland. Greenland. Where do we need to actually locate that? And what role then does Canada play? Although we're always reluctant to spend any of our money outside of our own territory, which we leave it to the United States. But nonetheless, for effective command and control, for an effective deterrence posture, I can't see in the future how at least Greenland can be left out.
How will the Northern and Polar warning systems improve upon the North Warning System? And what kinds of capabilities or upgrades can we expect?
The North Warning System, of course, agreed to in the early 80s as part of the North American Air Defense Modernization Plan, constructed and completed just shortly after the end of the Cold War, was primarily focused upon the problem of Russian, Soviet at the time, bomber threats. Its capabilities were designed under the belief, they're not technical capabilities of the Russians in terms of air-launched cruise missiles, to be able to locate the bombers before they reach their launch points. Because of shorter-range cruise missiles, they would basically have to come into the Canadian Arctic. And probably given its location along the mainland of the Canadian Arctic, because it doesn't extend up into the Arctic island archipelago, that was its purpose. We will get the bombers before they can launch their cruise missiles. Well, that's all changed now. We can't get the bombers anymore. Long-range air-launched cruise missiles, increasingly long-range sea-launched cruise missiles, and the Russians, following on their Soviet military behavior, like to bastion their submarine launch capabilities with their ballistic missile or cruise missiles capabilities under the Arctic ice, because it's very hard to find them, not least of all because of the noise of Arctic ice moving, etc. You now face this dual threat where, in fact, launch points will be far removed. So the North Warning System is obsolete. In fact, I've argued that we're effectively blind almost, because it can't really track cruise missiles because of the low radar cross section and the ground hugging capabilities. And certainly it's not optimized or capable to deal with hypersonics in the higher altitudes of what I call suborbital space. So what the new capabilities, the Arctic and the polar lines they're talking about, and it's unclear whether they're talking about two lines, separate lines, or integrated line, single line, is designed to be able to look over using over the horizon radars, which is a mature technology, to be able to look over to at least be able to identify bombers far over the pole before they reach their launch points. Now, whether you can vector your fighters, given their ranges, even with refueling capabilities, is another question. But also, purportedly, will have the capability to track cruise missiles in flight because the nature of the radar beams, they look down. And in order to get a cruise missile and track it effectively, you need to be able to look down on it, because head-on is problematic. And it also needs to be more powerful in order to deal with the hypersonic question. So that's our solution to one part of this. And although, as I read through the tea leaves, we're exclusively talking about replacing the North Warning System with these two capable over-the-horizon systems, what is unclear is it's not what is limited about this is it's a ground-based component as far as we know, although the department talks about space-based capabilities, but what those are and when they're coming online for us relative to what the Americans are up to is a big open question, which is unspecified. It's sort of, yeah, in the future, we'll sort of do this, maybe not, we'll see. But you can't have, and generally, particularly out of NORAD thinking and other areas of thinking, ground-based systems are an important layer, but you need more. You need air-based systems, which is AWACS, or an updated, modernized AWACS system, which we don't have. We rely upon the Americans. Space-based capabilities, potentially maritime capabilities. I would point out in this regard, the future combat ship of the Canadian Navy is going to have a small version of the Lockheed Martin long-range discrimination radar. This is a radar, a big one, which has gone to replace the existing ballistic missile warning radar in clear Alaska. It's likely to have capabilities, particularly to deal with the hypersonic problem. Problem, of course, is they're not ice capable, and they have a limited ability to sustain themselves in the Arctic. But everyone's talking about you need to be able to take land, ground, air, sea, space, integrate them all together, develop the command control communications networks and processing systems in order to have an effective surveillance system, which will deal with the threat environment. We're in one area right now, which is not surprising for us, and that's the Arctic, and that's the ground-based component. And everything else is left to the Americans. Now, how that is going to play out in terms of the Canadian-American agreement that the United States will pay 60% of infrastructure costs for NORAD in Canada remains to be seen. And I'm sure that's been or is being negotiated, and an agreement is being reached or has been reached on this. But it's a much more complicated, it's a much more costly system. And it also raises questions of whether instead of the North Warning System, which you had one single line, whether in fact you need to go back to the 50s where we had 3 radar lines and potentially have another radar line lower down in order to deal with what potentially I would call leakers. You're not going to get them all. So you still need to be able to track them, because one of the problems with the system is once they fly over, we lose them. Now, NORAD is integrated with civil radars, NAV Canada and the FAA in the United States as the function of 9/11, but those radars aren't capable or powerful enough to deal with that problem. So you could see this now extends to a much broader modernization plan, which the government isn't talking about.
What issues does a fully integrated air missile defense system raise for the current NORAD mission suite relative to Canada-US cooperation on continental defense?
In the past, NORAD was in the air defense business, very much traditional, historical, date back, if you like, to in the wake of strategic bombing in World War II. We're going to deal with airplanes, intercept airplanes. And that's what we did. And that's how we thought about it, notwithstanding cruise missiles. But again, the whole point was bombers, 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 bombers. Today, NORAD by default is in the missile defense business. It's not air defense anymore, because you're going to have to deal with cruise missiles and you're going to have to deal with hypersonics in order to deter their use. So we're in. This is missile defense now. As you know, the government of Canada is loath to use the term missile defense because it raises the issue of ballistic missile defense, which raises interesting questions. You may recall that at the announcement by the defense minister in Trenton, when this was raised, ballistic missile defense was raised, she said, basically, we haven't changed our policy, but we're keeping an eye on it. Then the chief of the defense staff stood up and said, well, we've got to deal with integrated air and missile defense. Now, this is what's going on in the United States. It's an initiative that dates back some time now to the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army is responsible for air defenses and missile defense. It's their mission. It's not an Air Force one. They began working at the ground level in integrating Patriot terminal phase missile defenses, which also has high altitude air defense capabilities, integrating them, the capabilities and batteries together, and also then seeking to integrate them with THAAD or theater defenses. And then, of course, this then takes you down to the point where, as technology develops, you will integrate them with ballistic missile defenses. So you will have a set of radar tracking capabilities, which will be functional to deal with the full range of missile problems. And of course, coordinate your capabilities so that depending as your adversary, if we think in case of Russia, has a variety of choices of what to use against us, we need to be able to have capabilities that can respond. So the next answer to this is Canada's policy on ballistic missiles defense sustainable? Does it, by default, as the Americans move down here, and this, of course, raises the issue of point defenses, whether, in fact, we can stay aside any longer. Certainly, rhetorically, you can imagine it. Ballistic missiles are different, so we can do cruise missile defense, we can do hypersonics, but we're still not going to do ballistic missile defense. Or a better way to put it is, we're not going to get interceptors on Canadian soil. And that's always been a real big problem for the Canadian government. Surveillance capabilities, tracking capabilities, well, we can do that. But that nicely then fits into NORAD's mission suite. Early ballistic missile early warning, and these radars will serve different functions as well, related to the NORAD mission suite and other things, space track, etc. So what is likely going to happen, at least in my view, is, and again, we have no plans to purchase or acquire any true missile defense capabilities as of yet. There is some ground-based surface-to-air missile capabilities that are coming out of the 2017 white paper, but those are short range and for overseas forces. There's been no discussion of what we might need in Canada to deal with the cruise missile, the hypersonic threat. We can do those. We won't do interceptors. Question remains, of course, is whether the United States proceed with a third site in upstate New York, and that will then require forward-based tracking systems and battle damage assessment systems and queuing systems, and Canada is the place to put them, because like the North Warning System, the radar systems in the north to deal with ballistic missiles, once they fly over, well, we don't really sort of lose them. The only one that can track them is Cavalier, which is in North Dakota, which was designed originally as an ABM site, a missile defense site, but then integrated into the early warning system out of fears of, ironically, potential ballistic missile launches out of the Hudson's Bay area. So there's a problem. There's gaps there that need to be filled. So at the end of the day, the U.S. will push this, will go forward with this, and we will have to respond to it. And eventually the missile defense issue will reemerge. And I think the government is going to have to be very careful in trying to walk a fine line. But I would add one other thing about the ballistic missile defense problem. As the minister said, we're not changing our policy. What we don't know from this government, nor from previous governments, why we said no. They have never publicly explained why they have said no. Historically, with missile defense, our no was partially about issues about missile defense destabilizing the strategic relationship with the Soviet Union. It was dangerous. It would lead to potentially preemptive strikes. We shouldn't go down that path. Not that I agreed with that argument, but I understood the politics behind it. With, of course, a large domestic group in Canada who were opposed to it on principle. Well, it's too late now. Missile defenses are, the horse has bolted the barn, if you will. You can't close that anymore. So this has to be grappled with and dealt with by the Canadian government, which they don't want to do.
Is there a risk that the investment plan for NORAD modernization, $40 billion over the next 2 decades, could be susceptible to disruption as a result of competing government priorities, changes in government or political will?
Again, if you go back to the 80s, the Air Defense Modernization Plan and the North Warning System, that sort of slipped in and no one paid attention to it. And it was funded. Now, it's interesting, and I've been thinking about this, is I don't know if anyone has ever done a study of how that all played out. Who paid for what and how they... It'd be interesting to find out because it'll tell us something about today. But I would suggest the North Warning System costs are much less than what's coming down the pipeline. So the first question, I think, is $40 billion going to be enough? And usually, as we all know with government programs, estimates and take the future combat ship are always low. This is going to cost more and more money, and we don't know. Because there are other things that, such as the intercept side, which we haven't really dealt with at all. So you have that issue. If there's any vulnerability, and everyone knows 20 years is a long time in the world of politics and economics. We don't know what the economy is going to look like. The consensus that emerged, which made it easier, although I don't think it's that overly significant in the decision of the government to move forward with funding this year, the consensus as a result of the war in Ukraine certainly silenced what you would have expected critics of this massive investment, which would have likely been portrayed as militarizing the Arctic and blah, 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 is not going to disappear forever. We can't predict not just the political and economic world in Canada and in the global system. We can't predict what the international environment. I don't think we're going to be enemies with Russia forever and ever, amen. Not least of all because if you read the American tea leaves, they talk about Russia, but they're really focused on China, and that raises interesting political questions. So the environment will change. The ability of the government to spend and willingness to spend will be affected. But once we're in, and we're in now, and the Americans are in, although we don't know what the Americans are actually going to do because no one's told us about that. And the Americans don't really talk about it. It's kept quiet. Everyone wants to keep this quiet because of the sensitivity, or as you know, of our political relationship with the United States. The key question to the vulnerability of it is really, in many ways, in my view, not here. It's the American side of the equation. Will the Americans stay committed to this big thing they want to develop for North American deterrence requirements? Or will the Americans start to back off and then we'll follow suit? So I'm not overly concerned. I'm concerned that there's not enough money at the end of the day. I'm concerned about the details. I'm concerned that the government will suddenly find the nice, quiet environment it has politically will not be as quiet as they would like it to be. But again, we can't predict that because, as you know, as everyone knows, NORAD has always been kept under the political radar. Let's keep this quiet on this. And that's likely to continue. And it partially explains why we have so few details from the government on this. If the economy goes south, looks potentially a recession coming, depending how you read inflation, interest rates, all that stuff. This will be constraints on government spending. They'll be looking to cut, and defense is always in the game. But the real answer will then revolve not so much on what the government does or says or thinks, because they don't really know the details of this. And it's understandable, it's very complicated and highly technical. It's what the department will do. So if you go back to the cuts that were instituted by the Harper government in poor economic times, one of the things the Harper government did different from the Chrétien government earlier in the 90s was basically said every department's going to take X percentage cut. That's all we want. Where you cut is your business. So now you get into the internal bureaucratic politics of national defense, which will be informed by perceptions with the United States as its priority, because the American budget will also be hit in negative circumstances. And that's how you'll see it play out. And this becomes potentially problematic because Canadian defense thinking, like American defense thinking, always prioritizes defense overseas. That's the priority. We meet the threats to North America, to the homeland over there. Well, the current threat environment says that we can't do that anymore. We cannot simply ignore North American defense. And this becomes increasingly important. So there'll be pressures, yes. Probably as long as the Americans remain committed, we will follow along. And the issue then becomes, if the economy goes bad or the politics go bad about this around the whole issue of defense spending. Because remember, it's not just 40 billion. It's all the billions that have been assigned to national defense since 2017. Of course, questions, can they ever spend it? That's another problem. It will be how the department deals with it.